In gaming's far-flung past of the 90s and 2000s, there used to be far more regular misfires that truly astonish you at every level. They weren't like the messes of today with glitches and performance issues. No, these games were on another level. Titus's Superman 64 and RoboCop. Pretty much anything by Cryo Interactive after their Dune game. These games certainly functioned, but their design was so impressively broken at a fundamental level that entertainment had to be drawn from the gristle and bone marrow buried so deep that you questioned the point of the exercise. And now we can add striking distances the Callisto Protocol to that illustrious list. I'm not even sure Callisto Protocol knows what it wants to be. Is it a brawler? A shooter? A spooky horror game? Action-packed? Stealthy? A Dead Space successor? A project that stands on its own? It tries for all of these things, only to provide them in their worst forms possible. Yes, sadly, all the bad things you've heard are 100% correct. Callisto Protocol is the first real AAA failure of the 9th console generation, and my word does it do so with style. Like a diver making every necessary preparation, except to make sure that the pool they're leaping into has any water in it. Make no mistake, Callisto Protocol is a dry, empty, confused husk of a game despite everything going for it. Multiple creative leads from Dead Space given near seemingly total creative freedom, thanks to the funding of the publisher of PUBG and a brand new wave of consoles with untapped potential. All of this in its favor. How did we end up here? It's legitimately amazing how little story there is that doesn't constitute a spoiler because the vast majority of Callisto Protocol is nothing. A void of creeping through similar looking hallways and bitter, darkened rock quarries. What can I say without spoiling is that everyone outside of the protagonist, Jacob Lee, is infinitely more interesting than what he brings to the story. Considering in particular that co-star Danny Nakamura, played by The Boys' Karen Fukuhara, has actual backstory, personal drive, and a reason to be imprisoned at Black Iron Prison, you're constantly left wondering why she's not the main protagonist and why Jacob Lee is even here. Even as bland protagonists go, Jacob is just a gaping hole where charisma dies, and it's hard to tell if that's on voice actor Josh Duhamel or his mocapped animations. There are definitely a few scenes where his animations appear to be unfinished, such as facially responding to a spinal surgery like one might to stubbing their toe particularly hard. By contrast, Days Gone's Sam Witwer co-stars as the main antagonist prison guard with so much more charm that you almost end up rooting for him instead of Jacob. Nowhere is this lack of focus priorities more evident than with the combat. Shooting is perfectly serviceable with some neat high-end perks for your guns that you'll likely never see unless you specialize or wait for the New Game Plus update in 2023. Yes, really, they launched without it. Yet shooting only takes center stage later, giving way to the real star of the show, melee combat. It mixes punch-outs, dodging mechanics with an Arkham-style magneticism to the brawling, presented with a camera more firmly jammed into the protagonist's spine than in God of War on PS4. Players also receive a truncated version of Dead Space's telekinesis, now working more like a Force grip from Star Wars The Force Unleashed, but with such a low battery capacity that you'll rarely use as much as you'd like to. Granted, there were more than a few fights that looked impressive in hindsight, but I was just wildly button mashing and abusing the poorly implemented dodge system as the combat barely clung to coherence. Dodging left and right with your analog stick instead of using a dedicated button rarely works as intended, made worse by the camera swinging wildly when it decides to focus on another opponent. It says something that dodging was barely spoken of before release because it feels awkward at the best of times. There's no real strategy at play, enemies are always faster than you, necessitating you while your left analog stick and hope for the best. Exploration is next to non-existent due to how linear every level is, but player progression is a rare highlight. There really is some wild stuff to unlock, but you have to know it's there so you don't waste the points on, say, making your stun baton 50% better at blocking, rather than heat-seeking shotgun shells. Still, it's by far the most satisfying part of the game to engage in with a neat circular menu and excellent 3D printing animations. To be fair, many of the ideas present here aren't necessarily bad in isolation. Any of these choices could have worked, just not in this exact combination. Instead, you're caught in a perfect storm of a game that's not actively built really to scare you so much as grind you into the dirt no matter what difficulty you're on. What good does having multiple health kits do you if Jacob has to sit down and stare at the needle like it's the first time he's ever seen one before? He does this no matter how far into the game you are, even while a horde of biophage infected charge at you from every angle. Just stick it in, man! You know what it is! This clunkiness extends to the entire user interface. You can't listen to audio diaries while walking, navigating the inventory menu is needlessly stiff, and swapping your arsenal is overcomplicated by a refusal to use all 4 D-pad buttons like most games would for quick select. Instead, everything has to be awkward as hell, fighting against you in ways that merely add aggravation, not meaningful tension. Now, the music is solid, and the sound design, if overly dramatic at times, works well. However, the biggest hurdle Callisto Protocol stumbles over is far more unavoidable: the art direction, which is to say, there isn't much of one. Callisto absolutely has the fidelity of a major AAA release, but despite that, there's nothing distinctive here really. From obviously copy-pasted assets that don't fit certain settings, to almost every enemy type being some variant on roast zombie covered in pimples. Those cool-looking robots barely factor into the game, and you can pretty much slip by them all with no trouble. There's also a repeated jump scare with one character model that's so contrived that as I played, a member of my family watching alongside me replied in deadpan, "Hey, do you think that was a jump scare?" It's amazing how unfrightening the journey is, relying so heavily on protracted, gory death animations that just take forever. They aren't inventive or scary, just gross. I don't know, maybe the creative ones are waiting as DLC, which is a whole other kettle of fish. And as much as I loathe to bring up the comparison, there's nowhere near the ambition with these biophage zombies as there was with Dead Space's Necromorphs. Most variants end up not fighting all that differently other than spitting or taking a bit more damage. Of the 2 biophages that are memorable, one is hilariously easy to kill by any means, while the other is so frustrating to fight that they're essentially a mini-boss despite being presented as a normal enemy. And the whole mutation gimmick just isn't nearly as interesting as dismemberment. It protracts fights longer because, hey, that enemy you almost had dead had enough time to regrow a limb. As for actual boss fights, there are only 2 to speak of, one of which is just a tutorial for the final fight of the game. Neither one is fun to engage in, especially as the final fight strangely tosses aside most of the core gameplay elements for something ripped straight from Resident Evil. This speaks to the central issue of Callisto Protocol. There is no core thesis here. Every time it can, Callisto grasps at ideas you already saw executed better in other franchises. I don't know what the central hook is supposed to be here, as the final threads try to tie off just enough for not 1 but 2 cliffhanger endings. You realize that none of it really meant anything or said anything. Jacob barely has an arc. They really have to cram it in at the last second, and it totally is not earned. The villain's plans are as ludicrous as they are unfeasible, making Assassin's Creed's grand conspiracies look realistic by comparison. Nothing connects into a meaningful message about anything. It all just fades into another void where the heart of the experience should have been to knit it all together. That's what's truly most disappointing. I didn't need Callisto Protocol to be my new Dead Space, despite whatever striking distance seems to think. What I wanted was for them to find that creative heart that led EA Redwood, later Visceral Games, through so many projects. They had a soul to them that was all their own. Even when the studio split into Sledgehammer Games, you could feel the spirit there, but it's not here. This feels like a product at best, and at worst, a hasty attempt to one-up the series Callisto draws so much blatant inspiration from. The Callisto Protocol might function, and its launch issues are already being addressed with patches, but in no way can I recommend it to anyone but the most morbidly curious. Everything was stacked in this game's favor, and it still wasn't enough. We didn't need Dead Space 2.0, we just needed a cohesive, focused game. Instead, it's just a soulless concoction of unfocused ambitions, poor planning, and inconceivably amateurish design. Whether you're winning or losing, Callisto Protocol never feels right. And that's our review of the Callisto Protocol. If you've stuck it out through the disappointment, good on you. Feel free to check out our other reviews of much better games, and give a like, subscribe, and tap that darn bell so you get all the latest from DualShockers videos. I've not been Chris, you've been a real trooper, and that's all folks. Cheers!